What is interesting about 0 and 1 is that they are two of the main paradigms that have been used historically to describe the mystical path, the contemplative path, the path to enlightenment. In some traditions, it's described in terms of a oneness experience. That's very common around the planet. And in some traditions, it's described in terms of a kind of zero or emptiness. The word in Sanskrit for the number 0 is shunya or shunyata, which is also the word in Buddhism, which for the emptiness as the source, emptiness as the nature of sensory experience. So the same words are used, the very same Sanskrit word. The bigger an experience is for us, the more overwhelming an experience is for us, is just a measure of how large the polarization, the splitting of the 0 of the source, how far it has split, how much time, space, volume, and how much sensory intensity has been born in between that polarization. And if we can have a complete experience of such a large polarization, the 0 that comes when there is a reuniting, which inevitably happens, for us will be a deeper purification, a deeper enlightenment than for a small challenge, you might say. The 1 could be looked upon as 1 is any size you want, is 1. Alternatively, you could say that 1 is the combined effect of all canceling stretches and squeezes. Okay, you multiply by 3 and divide by 3. That's one kind of polarization. Okay, if you multiply by 1,000 and divide by 1,000, that's another kind of expansive, contractive, stretch, squeeze polarization. So they play analogous roles. If we think of nature as being capable of creating distinction and wiping away distinction, if that's in some way a fundamental activity of nature, then that would be reflected in our consciousness, certainly. If we are able to fully give ourselves to the forces of division, the forces that pull to the right, pull to the left, that stretch this way, that squeeze this way. If we fully give ourselves to those forces, then there's nothing to get in the way of the neutralization, the coming back. And if you want to think of it as coming back to a oneness, you can. Or if you want to think about it as coming back to a zeroness, you can also do it that way. So let's talk about the experience of oneness in some of its guises. We might speak of the alienation of thought and feeling, and we could then speak of the healing of that alienation and a unification of thought and feeling. Thought arises through either visual thinking, auditory thinking, or both at the same time. And emotionality arises through the limbic system in the brain, which causes affective somesthesia, a nice fancy way of saying body sensations that seem emotional. If you pay attention to what happens when you experience anger, fear, sadness, embarrassment, impatience, disgust, interest, joy, love, gratitude, humor, smile, etc., these have flavors in the body. They're initially maybe nebulous, but eventually they're just as distinct as hot or cold. The the soma, the body, can be trained into emotional high-resolution screen. There's no official word for body sensations that seem emotional in nature, so I call it what? Feel, just to have a word. And notice I say feel, not feeling, because feeling has a gazillion connotations, so I sort of made it an unusual noun by using feel as a noun to point out that it's a technical term within this system. So we have the body sensations that are emotional in nature to us. We have mental images and internal talk. Now, when you have a complete experience of feel, image, talk, you are too busy experiencing it to fixate it. A complete experience is an experience where there is an extraordinary degree of concentration, clarity, and equanimity, sort of all coming together. We can't always have all three of these. In fact, sometimes we can't have any of these. You may have noticed. We can't always have all three. When all three do come together at a certain critical mass, then ordinary experience becomes utterly extraordinary. And my word for ordinary experience that has become utterly extraordinary is a complete experience. Now, it's a technical term, though. I don't mean complete in the sense it was intense. I don't mean complete in the sense that, I don't know, you stayed with it to the end. That's part of it, okay? By complete, I mean that there was a certain critical mass of concentration, clarity, and equanimity present from beginning to end in that experience. That constitutes what I technically call a complete or full experience. We can't always have complete experiences, but sometimes we can. And with practice, we can have it more and more and more. And when we have a complete experience of something that's ordinary, it's utterly extraordinary because it's utterly paradoxical. I read the St. John of the Cross poem to you, La Noche, to give you a flavor of how something could be sensorially rich and yet also utterly transparent and vacuous at the same time as a single experience. So ordinary experience becomes extraordinary in that it becomes both deeply fulfilling and no longer there. And therefore, ordinary experience becomes extraordinary because it's paradoxical. I just said something that really doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And I'm afraid many people would probably think is irrelevant to anything. Maybe they just think this is philosophical speculation or wordsmithery. I'm sorry, I have no choice. That's how you'll know when you start to have complete experiences. You end up having to say this stuff whether you want to or not. One could also say that when you bring a certain critical mass of concentration, clarity, and equanimity to an ordinary experience, it becomes utterly extraordinary. You could also say when you bring an extraordinary degree of concentration, clarity, and equanimity to an extraordinary experience, like a God manifesting fully in front of you, that experience becomes utterly ordinary. That's the path of liberation as opposed to the path of powers.